One of the biggest questions I get asked is what computer do I recommend for video editing, what specs does it need to have, and what external hard drives are best for editing off of. Now the main goal in buying a computer is to find one that can edit your footage as fast as possible, because the faster you can edit your videos, the sooner you can get on to the next project, thus allowing you to make more money. So investing in a good computer is absolutely necessary to running a successful video production company. And to determine how fast a computer will be at editing video footage, there's a lot of things to look for, but there are 4 main specs that we'll go over in this video. The first is the processor, second is the memory, third is the graphics, and fourth is the storage. Now let's start with that last one, because the storage is probably the most important element to a speedy computer. If this is slow, everything else is going to be slow. Now most new computers today will have an SSD or solid state hard drive, which has no moving parts, so it works much faster than an HDD or hard disk drive, which does have moving parts, so it makes basic tasks like launching Premiere Pro or opening your Chrome browser perform about 2 to 4 times slower. So the first thing to do is to make sure your computer has an SSD hard drive. Now there are also hybrids between SSD and HDD like a Fusion drive. Don't mess with those, just get an SSD. And when buying computers, you'll usually get options on how much storage space you want on that solid state hard drive, and I recommend getting at least 256 gigabytes. Any less than that and you're going to be constantly running out of space and having to delete old files off of your computer in order to be able to run anything. My first computer that I ever bought was a used 13-inch MacBook Pro that I bought for around $1,000, and I did make sure that it was an SSD, but I got the lowest amount of storage at 128 gigs so as to save some money, but I was constantly running out of space and having to delete files, and it got super annoying. So now I personally always get at least 1 terabyte for plenty of space, like on my current MacBook Pro that cost me around $4,000 total, but upgrading your solid state storage space is going to get pricey very fast. For example, on my $13,000 iMac Pro, which is my main computer that I currently edit on, I maxed out all the specs, so I got 4 terabytes of storage, which is a $2,400 upgrade. Now if I could go back, I think I would just do the 2 terabyte and save $1,800. Moving on to our second most important spec for speedy video editing is the processor, or CPU, which stands for Central Processing Unit. The speed of a processor is measured in gigahertz, and most new computers today will come with multiple processors referred to as cores. So you'll see the speed of each core and then the total number of cores at that speed. The processor is going to be responsible for processing your footage faster, which will affect things like playback or the choppiness of your footage in your editing timeline, your render speeds, your export speeds, etc. So generally, the more processing cores you have at higher speeds, the faster those tasks will perform. Keep in mind though that as you upgrade to more cores, each of those cores will be slower, so it's kind of a trade-off. And most editing tasks don't require many cores. So for example, my current MacBook Pro has 6 cores at 2.9 gigahertz per core, and my beefy $13,000 fully maxed iMac Pro has 18 cores at 2.3 gigahertz. And when exporting out the same 15-minute 4K video, my MacBook Pro did it in 7.5 minutes, and my iMac Pro did it in 8.5 minutes. So clearly spending the extra money on 3 times more cores wasn't worth the reduced speed of each core. In fact, there are very few programs out there that can even take full advantage of 18 cores, as most software developers are going to be optimizing their software for the masses, and most people don't have 18 cores. So programs like Premiere aren't going to be able to use much more than around 8 cores at any given time. So if I could go back, I wouldn't have upgraded my number of cores on my iMac Pro and saved myself $2,400. But as a good base, I would say getting at least a quad core, ideally 8 cores. But as you can see in this graph that shows the performance of Photoshop and Premiere depending on the number of cores, you see that Photoshop can't use more than 6 cores. After 6 cores, the performance flatlines, and Premiere can use up to 18 cores. However, you see the increases in performance are very minimal after around 8 cores. So again, if I could go back, I would save that $2,400 and just stick to 8 cores at the higher gigahertz per core. And going back to my very first MacBook Pro that I used to edit hundreds of videos, that one only had 1 core at 2.3 gigahertz, and though it wasn't very fast, it got the job done for the first year of my career editing 1080p footage. So you can definitely get by with much less as long as you aren't working with high resolution footage like 4K. But moving on to the next important spec is the memory. Basically, the more memory you have, the more apps you can run simultaneously, and the better they will each perform. Memory is measured in gigabytes of RAM, and as a baseline minimum, you're going to need at least 8 gigabytes of available RAM to be able to use editing software like Premiere Pro. But if if you get a computer with 8 gigs of RAM and you have your Google Chrome browser open with 10 tabs, that might take up about 2 gigabytes of RAM. And then you also have Photoshop open editing some photos, that might also take up another 2 gigabytes of RAM. So just those two things alone will take up half of your memory, leaving you with only 4 gigabytes to run Premiere, which isn't going to be enough to run it smoothly, so you're going to have to close out of all your other applications in order to run Premiere. So if you get 8 gigs of RAM, then you'll be able to edit 1080p footage as long as you close down all of your other programs while using Premiere. And in order to edit 4K footage, you're going to have to upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM, and that should leave you a little bit of wiggle room to use some minor programs in the background. And if you up it to 32 gigs of RAM, then you'll be able to edit up to 4K at 60 frames per second footage, and also be able to run a lot of background applications. And upgrading to 64 gigs is probably only necessary if you're editing 8K footage and plan on running other heavy programs like After Effects in the background. Again, going back to my first MacBook Pro, it only had 8 gigs of RAM, which worked fine for the 1080p footage that I was editing, but once we started shooting in 4K, I had to upgrade my computer. Now my current MacBook Pro has 32 gigs of RAM, which I think is great for just about everything that I shoot, except for when I'm editing 8K red footage. And my iMac Pro has 128 gigs of RAM, which is probably overkill for my workflow since I don't use multiple heavy programs at the same time, so I probably could have saved $1,600 by just getting 64 gigs of RAM and been just fine. Also keep in mind that like the processor, there are also slower and faster types of RAM. We won't go into all the details, but one thing to look for is to make sure your memory says DDR4. Never buy anything labeled DDR3 or lower, or else the whole system will be outdated. But moving on to our last spec to look for in a computer is the graphics. For video editing, this is probably the least important spec to worry about because your GPU or graphics processing unit is basically a specialized CPU. So in general with video editing, the GPU just accelerates tasks that are generally managed by the CPU or the processor. But a good CPU or processor will carry most of the load, thus why focusing on getting a good processor is more important for video editing. Upgrading your graphics processor will play a much bigger role in more graphic heavy programs like After Effects, but since I rarely use After Effects, again, this is something that I probably could have saved that $700 in upgrade money on that iMac Pro and probably wouldn't have noticed much of a difference in my daily editing workflow performance. But there you have it guys, those are the main specs to look for in a computer. If you add all the things up that I upgraded unnecessarily on my $13,000 iMac Pro, if I would have gone with the specs that I just recommended to you right now, I would have saved $6,500, cutting the total price in half, and honestly probably wouldn't have noticed much of a difference in performance when editing in Premiere. So was it worth it to spend $13,000 on a fully maxed out iMac Pro? For me and my editing workflow, absolutely not. But I mostly did it to be able to tell you from firsthand experience that it's unnecessary so that you can learn from my experience and save yourself some good money. So what computer do I recommend you buying? Well, it depends on the resolution of footage that you plan on shooting and whether you're going to be doing graphic intensive work, but as a decent computer that can handle basic 4K editing, I'd recommend getting something like a 20-inch iMac quad-core at 3.6 gigahertz processor, and for RAM I'd recommend at least 16 gigs, and of course an SSD storage of 256 gigabytes minimum, which would put you around $1,700. Now for about the same specs, you could get an HP desktop computer for around $1,200, but that doesn't include a monitor, which would cost you several $100s depending on how nice of a monitor you want to get. But point is, you can definitely get more for your money if you choose to go PC over Apple, and you can save even more money if you choose to build your own PC. Personally, I'm an Apple guy. Having used both PC and Apple over the years, I think the operating system alone of Apple is worth going with Apple, and in my experience, Apple computers last a lot longer and have less issues along the way, but no doubt you can definitely save money for the same amount of specs if you go the PC route. And a question I get asked a lot at this point is, should I get a laptop or a desktop? Well, this depends on how much you plan on traveling and editing on the go. I used to travel a lot more, and a laptop was absolutely necessary because I needed to edit while I was on the road, but now I only travel maybe 3 or 4 times a year, so 99% of my editing is done on my desktop here at home. But even for those few times that I do travel, I need a computer to be able to dump my footage on my hard drives, so having a laptop is still essential for me. Unfortunately, for the specs, laptops are going to be more expensive than desktops, so for power for the money, desktop is the way way to go, but for editing and dumping footage on the go, a laptop is a must. So I'd probably recommend doing what I did. First, buy a used laptop to start out with, and when your business starts to grow and you start doing a lot more editing, invest in a faster desktop. And speaking of dumping footage on the go, the last thing to consider for editing speed, besides the computer, is the hard drive that you store your footage on and edit off of. And as a cheap option, I recommend getting 2 terabyte WD drives that you can pick up for around $80 on Amazon. These aren't super fast, but can store a lot for cheap. My personal favorite hard drive I use right now are the SanDisk 2 terabyte solid state drives that cost about 4 times more at $340, but they are going to be about 4 times faster at transferring footage and will allow you to edit off of them faster as well. Not to mention, if you drop a solid state hard drive, it's going to be just fine, whereas if you drop a spinning hard drive like a WD, they will most likely break and the footage will be inaccessible. Now, when I edit from home, I don't recommend editing off of either of those. I personally buy and use G-Tech drives as my master drives to store all of my footage that have much faster read and write speeds for faster file transferring and faster editing speeds. So just be aware that the speed of your hard drive that you're editing off of can also affect the speed of your editing workflow as well, but not nearly as much as the specs of your actual computer. And one last thing to be aware of, regardless of what computer you buy, if you use Adobe Premiere Pro CC, which is the software I use and recommend, it has a feature in the software that allows you to play the footage back at half or quarter resolution, which is what I usually do. That allows you to play the footage back at real time without it lagging or skipping frames. So don't panic if you buy a brand new computer and can't play back the 4K footage without it skipping frames. Some footage from some cameras are just terrible to work with and will be slow. But there you have it, guys. There's my recommendations on what to look for when buying a computer. Hopefully that will help you save some money in areas that are less important. This stuff can get pretty in-depth, but hopefully that gives you a basic idea of the most important things to look for when buying a computer. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.